now. Okay, so I would like to see up here member of European Parliament, Dragos Tudorache. Global Responsible AI Lead at Accenture, Eitel-Porter. Cecilia Bonefeld-Dahl, come back up here, Director General, Digital Europe. You can take your seat there, Cecilia, now being a member of the panel. Pedro Tavares, State Secretary for Justice, Portugal. You can take place in the sofa, right? And Florian, Tursky, State Secretary for Digitalisation in Austria. Go ahead and grab a seat at the sofa. And this panel will be moderated by Alberto de Felice, Director for Infrastructure, Privacy and Security Policy at Digital Europe. And let's warmly welcome him too.
Thank you very much, Mette. So good morning, everyone. The AI Act, the biggest proposal, I would say, from this commission. Would you say so, Dragos? Yes.
Well, it is.
Of course you would.
If you ask me, it is.
So let's talk about it. We're now nearing the, I think, hopefully, the final stages of defining the European Parliament's position. This has been a long discussion. This is actually a file that we started discussing before this commission with the previous commission, so a lot of effort and preparation has gone into it. If you had to pick one single issue that you could classify as the thorniest issue that you've had to tackle in your discussions in the Parliament, what would it be?
Well, I think it's exactly what we just heard earlier from the Bavarian minister. It is the high-risk Article 6 and Annex 3 combo. It's where I wouldn't say we had the thorniest, but we had the most intense, let's put it this way, discussions. And it is the one thing that I think will close at the very end. We are now at a stage where we have the final political package. As we speak, our technical teams, who are, by the way, the true heroes of this text, I think at some point, and I hope at some point someone will mention them. Sorry, my mic doesn't work as well. And as we speak, can you hear me?
No. Have we fixed it? Let's see. We need assistance on stage.
1, 2, 1, 2. Now it works.
There you go.
I'll put this on my side.
Done.
Here we go.
Self-fixed.
So as we speak, the technical teams are hard at work, and they do that every day for a couple of hours to figure out the final tweaks in the text. But again, Article 6 will be the last one. And it is the last one, and the thorn is because exactly what we've heard, which is the need to put the right filters in place so that we make sure that we don't capture those kind of applications that we do not want to capture in the definition of what high risk is. And of course, that also becomes ideological because there are those that would prefer a bit of a broader brush so that, let's say, a broader spectrum of AI applications would be caught in that net. And there are others who ideologically would want to see a narrower approach to that. And of course, as always in finding compromises, the sweet spot is that place in the middle. The good news, let's say, is that we do have a majority that actually understands the need to put that sort of a filter, that sort of a funnel that will be narrowing down the broad scope of what the definitions in Annex 3 will be. And with that, I'm hoping, I don't want to jinx it, again, we're still working and negotiating that, but I'm hoping that the final architecture of Article 6 and Annex 3 will be one that will be bringing that balance between the need to protect and the need to innovate.
Indeed. There's big existential questions, I would say, about this proposal, right? You know, we're protecting fundamental rights, and we also want to protect innovation, and, you know, we want to be competitive as Europe when we do regulation as a result of that. And again, GDPR is always in the back of everybody's mind. You know, we want this to be the next GDPR and also avoid some of the issues that we've had with implementing the GDPR. In terms of existential questions, I want to go to Pedro next, because I think, you know, one of the uses of AI that are being discussed and already in place to some extent is injustice. And obviously your State Secretary for Justice in Portugal. And we heard yesterday, for example, from our Ukrainian speaker that, you know, the vision for 2030 is that in Ukraine they'll have, among the many GovTech things that they've been doing over the course of the years, will be AI-assisted justice. We're already starting to see those use cases emerge in the justice system, not only in law firms, but in the justice system proper. And Portugal has a new GovTech strategy that relates to justice. So how would you explain the role of AI there? How do you see it developing in Portugal and in Europe?
Hi. So first, thank you all and for the invitation to be here. So I would start by explaining where we started. So we had in Portugal a few years back in technological development of the justice systems. Most of the courts, the electronic case management in courts is mandatory, but it was still reflected the paper version of it. So we needed to shift clearly. And at the second time, being the justice system in Portugal, it includes 18 bodies. It goes from courts to the registry, from since we're born, when we create a company, or when we get a divorce, etc. So the offer of the justice system is so broad, people sometimes they feel lost. So we wanted to make sure that we could apply innovation in two ways. The first one was automating repetitive tasks for employees. We need more efficiency in Portugal, we need more efficiency in courts, but in registry and other areas. So we wanted to make more repetitive tasks to be automated, not replaced by machines. Obviously, we need people, but people to add value to where they really add. So we had people, for instance, the only thing that they did was anonymizing justice cases. After the sentence cases are done, they need to be published, and people had to anonymize the personal data. So we had like 20 people just doing that. So what we did was creating, obviously, an algorithm to make sure that data would be anonymized and it could be more transparent, and at the same time judges can use information for search, etc. So we needed that, but obviously we still need people to make sure that those criteria are correct, everything is correct, to make sure that the system goes well. The second part is for the access of justice. So as I said, it is quite broad, the justice system. So for instance, in Portugal, if you want to, and in other countries obviously, if you want to get a divorce, depending on the case, you can choose a court, or you can go to an ADR system, or even go to the registry. In Portugal, you can even divorce remotely with video conference, just by, you just put all your documents, everything is authenticated. There is someone who is the part of the system, from the justice system, but everything is remote. They don't need to be at the same room, which is good for people getting divorced sometimes. So yeah, so those solutions require people sometimes to find information in different places. Sometimes information is not updated. Sometimes information is not official, etc. So you wanted to create, in that case, a smart guide that does not replace, obviously, lawyers, etc., but can try to guide people between all the services. So for this case, we just reached Microsoft after they acquired half of the GPT technology, and we are launching just next week a tool that, using the GPT technology, but just with the justice sources. It just goes to our official sources. It gives you information on citizens, where should they go, where should they find out information, or even they can schedule, if it's quite simple, they can schedule automatically the divorce online in a few seconds, and they can terminate their issue just right away. So what our concerns were first, in the beginning, making sure we will not replace judges' decisions, or we're not replacing people, lawyers, for instance. We're automating processes where we need to add people for different areas from efficiency. And secondly, the second part is guiding people through justice, which is for us really important. So this GovTech strategy, the idea is inviting startups, inviting the ecosystem that usually sees public services as something very difficult, with the procurement system very complicated. We need to make sure that they can also think that this is where a lot of innovation happens, and we need to make sure this is communicated broadly to the startups. Otherwise, they just go to fintech, they just go to other areas, and we need them in public service. So that's the idea.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So I'll switch to Ray now. You have a global role for AI in a global company. And AI is definitely not new to Accenture, and definitely not new to you in your specific role. So how have you been doing it through the years? How do you do it internally in Accenture in terms of developing the sort of ethical AI systems that we want? And how do you work with your clients who will have to implement AI in their business?
So for us, the whole topic of responsible AI starts with our code of business ethics. So we've long had a code of business ethics with 6 core fundamental behaviors, and the responsible use of data and technology more broadly is one of those fundamental behaviors. What we've seen in implementing that, both within Accenture and with our clients, is that there are 3 critical success factors. I think the first is leadership and governance. So we start with a clear vision for responsible AI, which is grounded in strong principles, and those principles take on board best practice that we've looked across different organizations for. The program is sponsored directly by our CEO, Julie Sweet, and Julie is vocal publicly about the need for senior executives, specifically C-level executives, to actually lead in the field of responsible AI. And then what we've done is to implement the controls into our existing mechanisms. So we want to get widespread coverage across the organization, but try to avoid setting up new compliance processes which would introduce sort of more burden on the company. The second lesson learned, I think, is that you have to have enterprise-wide adoption. So you can't implement responsible AI in silos. It needs a collaborative effort across everyone, really, in the organization. So we've brought together business people, legal, obviously data science, HR, risk and compliance, CIO, etc., all to come together. And what we found is that we were then able to introduce our controls into our existing enterprise governance framework and a system called Archer. So we use that for monitoring the workflows and record keeping and so forth. And like the EU AI Act, we've taken a risk-based approach to things. So we start by identifying the use of AI. Where we find it, we put that in our inventory. Then we'll do a risk assessment. Based on the risk assessment, if it looks like it's higher risk, then we do a very detailed technical and qualitative evaluation of the use. And that leads to recommendations to ensure that responsible AI principles are incorporated by design upfront in the system. And then I think the third critical component is the capabilities that you need. So you do need deep technical expertise to implement responsible AI, but you also need broad awareness across the whole of the organization. So we've built training, for example, to raise awareness for everyone in the firm, but we've also built deep technical training and tooling, working with academia like the UK's Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for AI. And we've created a global center of excellence with more than 50 people who bring a range of different skills, so the technical, data science skills, legal skills, and others. And that team's available to help colleagues, for example, if they're going through an assessment and they're maybe not familiar with some of the particular techniques, or if it's a particularly complicated question. And that center of excellence is also building our toolkit the technical toolkit, looking across the best practice tools for bias and explainability and so forth out there in the market, and making sure that we have those available with appropriate training and documentation.
Thank you, Ray. I mean, quite impressive, and it sounds like it takes an army. This is happening already, and soon enough it will be mandatory for everybody. So this is, you guys are a big company, global company. Put yourselves in the shoes of an SME trying to do this, and this is the appropriate time for me to bring up our first poll, which asks the audience to do precisely that. Put yourselves in the shoes of a scale-up that wants to do AI. It has a very interesting AI use case. Where would you want to grow your business? Would you do it in the US? Would you do it in Europe? Would you do it in China? Would you do it somewhere else? Let's see what our audience says. So thank you very much, Ray. Next up, I have Florian, and he's, if Dragos is the parliament, Florian, you're the council, let's say. So we have everybody here, except, I guess, the commission at this point on this panel, but that's good enough. So you're preparing, clearly, not only going through the negotiations, and clearly you must have a number of views about the negotiations themselves, but you are also preparing for dealing with the implementation of the AI Act. There will be a lot of work for member states. You need to set up a whole system, competent authorities, you'll have to comply with it in the public system as well. Possibly sandboxes to help those SMEs deal with the complexity of doing this. How are you preparing for it in Austria?
I think first of all we have to realize that before December only our bubble was talking about AI. I think that's quite important, because half a year ago I was on a panel in the European Forum Alpbach, and I was telling the people, if you're talking to the people about AI, they have the picture of the Terminator in their heads. And now, since December, they have the picture of ChatGPT in their heads. And that's a pretty good thing, because right now they can imagine what AI really is and what the potentials of AI could be in the future. And that's quite a moment. And maybe you remember another moment we had like that, it was in 2007. Before, all of us for sure had smartphones, and then Apple brought out the first smartphone, and we had that smartphone, that iPhone moment, and one moment, and everybody was using smartphones. And the huge development raised after that. I think so also the AI Act is quite to the right moment. Because right now we have to have regulation, and also the people will ask for regulation. And for sure we can ask, hey, European, maybe we are too late, but we're the first, indeed, to implement it. And so maybe that's also an opportunity to set a benchmark again, a worldwide benchmark. We were talking about the GDPR today earlier. For sure, all of us had some troubles with the GDPR, but it was the European thing we installed, and right now it's a worldwide benchmark. And so I think that's also a big opportunity right now. But I fully support what Judith said before. Judith, I'm sorry, I know you're also a lawyer, but we don't need more lawyers in Europe anymore, we need more technicians. And for sure, that's the fear of many businesses. And how is it possible to implement the AI Act then on national basis? And I think that's the biggest problem we're facing right now. Also, the member of the parliament was discussing about the Annex 3 and the high-risk solutions and so on. And so there has to be a legal certainty for the businesses. I think that's the most important thing we have to provide. Otherwise, there will be very, very big problems of innovation in Europe. And we have to take this balance between innovation and regulation. And regulation will be very important in the future when it comes to AI, but there has to be also, we have to put our eyes right now also on legal certainty and how we can provide also solutions in the AI Act to give the business this opportunity to do more innovation in Europe, but not less.
Thank you, Florian. Businesses, so Cecilia, there you go, good to see you. It's a bit awkward to be moderating a panel with you, but anyway, I'll do it.
Oh, she's
You have invested a lot of your personal time in this proposal, and as I said, this is a proposal that goes back to the previous commission, and we all know that this started with a high-level expert group that had long debates. Everybody was in the expert group, and they were fighting it out until the output of that group came out. It was a long process, and right now we're right in the middle of it, right? We're in rain and mud, fighting it out, figuring out what will be high risk, what will not be high risk. Is it looking all right to you right now, or do you think that we should have done a few things differently in the run-up to the big discussions between Parliament and Council?
Well, let me put it like this. I think we have a major gap between the people that really understands AI and the people who are trying to regulate it and the people who think they might want to be protected against it. And I think that gap will not serve us well when we start even implementing, no matter whether we regulate or not. And I think political leadership, I hope that somehow in the future we will change our policymaking process. I would like to see much more, time spent on educating citizens instead of trying to protect them against something that we don't know exactly what is. I would like to see much more sandboxing. We have a scale-up community of 100 scale-ups in Europe, working all with artificial intelligence, all the coolest solutions you can imagine, all waiting to grow. Why don't we take a hard stop? We take half a year where we sandbox the regulation before we take the decision. Because, I feel that there's this, we do an assessment, impact assessment, then it goes through a long, cumbersome, laborious process, and then, boom, it's there. But there is too little involvement of both citizens and smaller companies in really saying, what does it mean? Will it make me more competitive? Is it the right legal certainty? Is this actually dangerous? I don't believe that these companies are waking up in the morning thinking, I will harm someone. I'm doing this to harm someone. I believe that 99.9999% of everybody wants to do good, are trying their best, and they want to be compliant. And I think they have to be much more of a part of a solution of shaping this. And it's become a little bit like a regulatory race. I mean, how fast can we get this through council, right? Everybody nods their head and it runs. Where I think, you're just taking a deep breath and saying, does this make Europe the place where the values of our inclusive democracy is mirrored down to the products that are also produced in Europe? Right now, we don't have a balance. I mean, AI is being developed, and then they leave Europe. It's developed, leaving Europe. So if we want kind of a geographical spread of AI development in the world, also being in Europe, I think that our policymakers and the way that we do policy in EU and the member states needs to be much more inclusive towards our businesses. Particularly some of our really kind of future unicorns, which you know that I'm passionate about. So yes, more sandboxing, not after the fact, which is what is written into the AI right now, but before the decision. And we could learn so much from policymakers on what are their worries, what are their voters saying, but they could really also learn from the employees and our customers and clients. I mean, when we put products to market, it's not that we wake up one day and we just throw products on market, right? We go through extensive tests, we work with the hospitals if they're our clients, we work with the consumers. So I think there's so much learning lost between public and private sector that in the future, this would be my one thing on AI. Remember, the first legislation on cars, automobiles, was that someone had to walk in front of the car shouting, there is an automobile coming, there is an automobile, because they said maybe the engine will take over and go crazy and kill people on the road, right? So the first automobile legislation ever. I mean, it didn't last long, right? But it was made by people with good intentions, but it was just not workable, right? So we have to be a little bit careful that this kind of world tech race of putting rules in place is not exceeding, the ultimate goal of making us more innovative, bringing great technology to the market, and also have a global geographical spread in who's actually doing that. Maybe one last comment. So we developed these seven principles out of this group, and I'm telling you, it was a very diverse group and not an easy task. It took us 2 years, and we came out with 7 principles of transparency, accountability, human oversight, social responsibility, etc., etc. And there's actually online we made like a questionnaire with 100 questions where governments and companies could go in and evaluate their use and development on AI. And I actually think, spreading that and really boosting it to the member states could have, raised our awareness in the public sector and in the private sector before we had run ahead. So it's not necessarily bad. I'm just saying, I think the process can really be improved. I'm super encouraged to hear that the member states are already like running ahead and getting experience. And we heard Romania is doing it, Portugal is doing it, Bavaria is saying like, let's also look at how we can hire more engineers. And I think we need to have respect in our own role that Europe is not exactly the place where the biggest AI companies are thriving at the moment. So yes, I would change the process, and that would most likely change the content in the end.
Very good. Very good. Is Europe the place? Everybody has spoken. Let's go to the poll. And it's neck to neck between US and Europe right now. And then there's, can I see Slido? There you go, elsewhere. And I'm still unsure whether elsewhere also includes the UK. I would say for everybody you're voting, elsewhere includes the UK because the AI Act will not apply to the UK. And I guess Switzerland and Singapore and others. But keep voting, keep voting. And I'll go to Dragos. By the way, we have Slido, so you can start asking questions. And if there's an interesting question, I will ask the question of the panel. So, Dragos, ChatGPT. Everybody has mentioned more or less ChatGPT already, so I'll mention it. I don't do anything, I don't pursue any course of action these days without asking ChatGPT first. That's what makes me so smart, of course. And of course, everybody, Florian said it, everybody now thinks about AI in terms of ChatGPT. And of course, the Parliament has been debating ChatGPT. You've said a few things recently about ChatGPT, and there's a lot of danger. It's also a system that you could argue is a very clear type of general purpose AI, because of course, yes, it generates text, but it can be used in the justice system, or it can be used for kids to do silly things, or avoid doing their homework and that sort of thing, which is sort of the reason why I use it, to avoid repeating, doing repetitive tasks, as Pedro put it. So, looking at this sort of general purpose system, do we need to already think that it's high risk, as the Parliament sometimes seems to think, or is it more appropriate to think about it in terms of transparency and then seeing, the verticals where it's implemented and maybe having more rules there?
Well, with the caveat that I have to be very, very careful what I say publicly, because we are in the heart of the difficult part of the negotiations, and this is the one thing next to the mentioned already Article 6 and Annex 3 where we're still debating. But I will venture and say what I personally believe, which is certainly that this is not high risk by default. And yes, I did speak publicly about the dangers, the potential dangers, but first and foremost, I think this is a formidable piece of technology that is going to, and I fully agree with Florian, be the iPhone of AI, also in terms of actually making it a very democratic and helping to close that gap that Cecilia was mentioning earlier. It is the moment when AI becomes democratic, when everyone speaks of AI, and everyone understands a bit of AI. Our citizens start seeing what AI can do also for them in their daily lives. So again, I think before speaking of dangers and harms, we have to understand and start thinking of how we harness the myriads of options that this new technology gives. And by the way, over the last couple of weeks, I've played with various demos of what these kind of LLMs, these kind of large language models can do, not only ChatGPT. And it's really formidable how much variety, how versatile, and how potent these algorithms are. And this brings me to what I think we do need to do, and where the focus of our work now in Parliament is when it comes to let's say, ChatGPT-like algorithms, because we are going to have something in the text. There is unanimity among all the shadows from all the political groups that we cannot do, sorry, Council, what the Council did, i.e. to push the can down the road and avoid or leave for the Commission later on in an implementing act to deal with that. We are going to take our responsibility and write something up. But I don't think, at least I'm hoping personally, that we're not going to write it from a high-risk perspective, but rather from a transparency perspective. Because what is a foundational model such as ChatGPT? It is a species of AI that has certain characteristics that is not yet allocated to a purpose that is high risk in itself, because then it would make it very simple, but because of its potency, because of its versatility, as I mentioned earlier, and also because of the fact that it's going to be in enormous amounts of products and services. It's going to be embedded in there with various layers of other elements to it, but it's going to be embedded in many applications. And therefore, there needs to be a thinking, and this is what we're doing right now, as to how we define the responsibility of those that are developing these sort of foundational models in the broader value chain of the final very complex products or services driven by AI. And at least, again, our efforts right now is focused on that, on how do we capture the responsibility of those developing the general purpose, the foundational model in that broader value chain, and what kind of rules do we attach to that responsibility. Again, still drafting. In a couple of weeks, hopefully, you will see the final product, but I am convinced, based on what we are discussing right now, that we're not going to do harm with the work that we do. And here, if I may take a few more seconds to address some of the points that were mentioned earlier, I do feel myself also this gap that we need to close, and I would like to think that we've done a little bit better this time around as legislators, as policymakers, because we did take time to educate ourselves much more, I think, than with other pieces of legislation. We were the ones, as Parliament, asking the Commission not to rush with the proposal in the first 100 days, as the Commission initially intended to do. And we did so precisely because we thought we needed to understand better, we needed to educate ourselves better, we need to understand and speak to stakeholders more. And I'm hoping that this is not going to be something that stops now with regulation. I think that's a very important point. I agree also that probably we could do more policy prototyping before we actually legislate. It's not something that is in our culture. I think we can start developing that culture. But I think also it's very important in the way we set up the governance for the implementation of this text, that we have this place very firmly anchored in the governance, in the place where decisions are made, that we have this space where all stakeholders, those developing AI, those, let's say, taking on the consequences of AI, all together can sit around the same table and bring constantly a reality check to those that will be making further decisions in adapting the text, moving it along with the evolution of technology. I think if we don't do that, if we don't manage to design, and again, I'm relatively confident that it will end up with a design in terms of governance, at least coming out of Parliament, that actually will do service to that objective, and hopefully then we can sell it to Council as well, to be able to, again, close as much as possible those gaps.
Thank you very much, Dragos. Ray, can I go to you first? Next, we saw it already in the poll. The big question again, would that balance governance, both for companies that will have to implement, the member states, everybody that will be part of this governance framework of implementing the AI Act. The big question for all businesses is, does this make Europe, your European operations, more competitive in a global race toward AI and the future of technology? What do you say?
Well, I think one of the fundamental aspects here is building trust with consumers, and ultimately I think that's the objective of the regulation, and I think it's been very effective in raising awareness about responsible AI. It calls people, around the world, and governments and companies, etc., to really focus on this issue, which I think is extremely important. And I think that for European companies, if they're operating under an EU AI Act kind of regime, then What that means is that consumers will have greater trust in the technology because they know that there are a set of rules around it, and rules tend to bring confidence. I mean, if we look at the way we legislate electrical appliances or other things, people use them confidently because they assume that the kettle or whatever it is they buy is going to be safe. And I think for companies operating in Europe that are then also operating globally, it will give them that experience of working within a sort of governance framework, which will give them a head start, in other markets, because governments globally are considering what kind of legislation or guidance, etc., they're going to bring in, and there's a general, move towards that. But I would just add that I think one thing we haven't really touched on here is the importance of standards, and the legislation is one thing, and I think that, when we work with companies, we see that actually setting up and implementing for responsible AI is a difficult thing to do. It's not something that you do in a few weeks or a few months. This takes a long time, typically several years, to set up your governance frameworks and get everything sorted out. And when you do that, you need to build a structure which is going to be flexible enough to cope with forthcoming legislation and guidance and changes, and also changes in technology. You don't want to be caught by surprise when the next ChatGPT comes out and suddenly you haven't thought about it really and your governance structures don't cope with it. So you need a framework which is flexible enough for technology innovation and flexible enough to accommodate new regulation. But then critical from a company perspective for implementation will be the standards. And I do think it will be incredibly valuable if globally there's more consensus, or that there is consensus in the future around a common set of standards to measure what we mean by AI and responsible AI, even if different regimes globally may take a slightly different perspective on particular aspects of the regulation or guidance and so forth.
Very good. Thanks a lot for that and for mentioning standards, because indeed they are a central part of how this will be done in reality. And there's a lot of questions. The first one being, are technical standards, can they be used to assess things like fundamental rights or not? And we know that the Parliament, among other things, is discussing that as well. But very big part. So, and they are being used, I think the international alignment around standards, as you mentioned, is very important. And that's true for something like justice also within Europe, because one of the challenges that we still have is to bring the justice systems together. So in that context, Pedro, how do you look at the role of standards? How do you expect, for example, in the justice system, that working with the other systems in Europe and between public and private sector in the future, we'll be using standards to solve some of the problems with AI?
Well, I would say that standards really are the key for this common development and the possibilities. But I would start with something that, like Cecilia said, and I think is important, is education. Because at the same time as we thought that AI was like the Terminator, the problem is right now we feel that, I do feel that technicians and lawyers, for instance, me coming from the Ministry of Justice, we don't speak often the same language. So we need to educate citizens, but also public servants, but also governments, because people don't know yet the potential use of AI, but also the risks of AI. So they just think about the risks, because like the cars, the first things when they implement cars, you put someone screaming, there's a car, obviously, because they're thinking about that. So the first part would be setting up clear education on what is the potential, what can it be done, and then the standards part is also very important, especially for us to be very competitive. I think, for instance, if you have standards for ID, a strong ID, it's better if you use a service in Portugal, in Estonia, in Belgium, but not just physical ID, obviously digital ID. If you have standards for interoperability, if you can access justice cases here or in Portugal, it's important. They have to have the same principles. Obviously transparency, obviously open data. AI, all the AI algorithms, they should be published. When we're talking about government, the construction, the criteria of construction of algorithms, they could and should be published. So it's better because we can use standards on all that. So I need that we can take the learnings of a lot of projects, of a lot of areas where we're working together, where people actually can move around Europe and make it really competitive, to make sure that for this, we won't have the problem that Cecilia mentioned, that we have developers. It has been, the first phase was done here, and then it was marketed elsewhere. Or even they live here in Europe, and they market elsewhere. So we cannot take the risk if we really are just focused on a very, very strict legal framework. Firstly, the technology will be 10 years ahead of that, so that's a problem, because we're always surprised by the GPTs of the future, and at the same time, we won't take advantage of that. So we need to really focus on leveraging that, making sure we take advantage of the standards of the European market that we have. We have done incredible things in the past. Obviously, there's a lot of areas where we've done, and this is important. So we should strengthen that, having clear, obviously, common for AI, obviously common principles, but I would say general principles. If it's too specific, then the technology will outpace that. And at the same time, we have to test. We have to really have sandboxes to make sure that we can test in Europe, develop in Europe, see if it goes well. If it doesn't, obviously, we won't develop. But taking the risks for some piloting on that, being on the government side, or obviously on the private side.
Thanks a lot, Pedro. In the meantime, we have the second poll that has gone up, and it's a similar question to the first poll. Will the AI Act make us more competitive, which is what I asked Ray. Right now, we look very conflicted about the answer to this one. We literally don't know, and the answer to the first one was also neck to neck, so it's not definitive yet. So please vote. We want to know. We want to know. Florian. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things in your first answer to my question, and you seem to be mentioning sandboxes and SMEs quite a lot, and you mentioned GDPR as well, and GDPR was interesting because I think a lot of folks were not following the discussions here in Brussels when the GDPR was being written, and a lot of people, I've had countless conversations in the past few years, were caught off guard and realized that they had to comply very late, and this is where all the drama about the GDPR actually started to happen for businesses. How do you think we can avoid that for the AI Act this time around?
First, I would like to add something to Pedro and to all this discussion. I have the fear that there will be a populistic discussion about the AI Act in the future. And so we have to frame also AI, and so it's also our opportunity as politicians to frame AI, how it's possible to help the people with AI. And Judith said AI is a tool and compared it with a hammer. And you can build a house with a hammer, but you can also kill somebody with a hammer. And so it's our opportunity as politicians to frame the AI hammer in helping people and not in killing people. And I think that's a very, very important thing when it comes to the next months. And for sure, the whole European political discussion is driven by media, is driven also by public discussion. And so it's also opportunity to really focus on the use cases, the daily use cases, where AI will be able to help people. And so we don't have to talk about the risk-based approach, we have to talk about the human-centric approach. And we also have to talk about digital humanism when it comes to AI, and Austria talks about digital humanism about since 2 or 3 years. Everybody was thinking what's Austria doing with digital humanism. But right now I think this discussion is getting bigger and bigger every month. to the regulatory sandboxes. I think that's quite important to have a safe and controlled environment for testing and developing. So I think that's quite important. In Austria, we installed such regulatory sandboxes in fintech. We did it a few years ago. It's working quite well. And right now I'm working on a regulatory sandbox law. In German, it's called Reallaborrahmengesetz. It's a really complicated term. Not only for AI, so for all technical solutions. To install a basic law where it's possible to build regulatory sandbox in fintech, in AI, and in all other fields.
Very good. Very good. Cecilia, yes,
sorry,
Ray,
just
please.
very quickly on your comment about GDPR and sort of readiness relative to the AI Act. What we see from companies is that they're definitely much more aware of the AI Act than they were of GDPR. We would estimate they're probably like a year earlier in terms of their recognition and awareness of what's coming and getting ready for it, which I think is a very good thing.
Very good. So the good PR effort in terms of getting people to know that this exists. And this actually links up very well with a question we have from the audience that maybe you can answer, which is what are the low-hanging fruits for companies in making sure they are ready? You already say they seem to be as knowledgeable about the AI Act as they can be under the circumstances. Is there anything they can do already right now? I mean, you are already doing a lot of things, but it does sound like a lot of things, right? Can everybody do the sort of comprehensive strategy that you already have in place?
So I think probably low-hanging fruit, where I would start is look at your existing risk and compliance structures and frameworks. You know, most companies have something in place already, so don't try and build, and we didn't try to build, you know, one of our mantras was reuse and not, you know, build new. So look at what you have at the moment and see where you can introduce specific controls that are AI focused into that regime. And most organizations now have some kind of data science framework or lifecycle management process, MLOps, whatever they want to call it. So most organizations have some structured development process for building AI models, and that's where I would start, is to look at that process from ideation through to data selection, data curation, model building, implementation, etc., and think about introducing the right questions, because it's all about questions and then technical tests. Introduce those right tests and questions through that process.
Very good. So don't lose it, reuse it, right? Cecilia, you have something to add there.
Yeah, no, just actually, just to highlight that the whole idea of education and inclusion and sandboxing, I mean, industry, of course, has a major role there, and I'm actually happy that you're telling that the companies are 1 year ahead of what they were with the GDPR. I mean, Digital Europe has 41 associations in the EU, Europe Plus, EU Plus countries, and we've been working very, very closely with all our membership organizations for them to basically involve and be aware of what's going on these key files. And it's been one of the major changes that we have done. We really invest a lot of resources in linking up with our very competent organizations so they can go to their membership companies and really involve them and get them ready. Yeah? So I would like to think that we might have, you know, improved also our processes in that way. And right now, as we speak, we are sandboxing the AI Act with 10 of these future unicorns. You saw the winners of this year yesterday. So we will be coming out in April with a report on what are they saying? I mean, how do they look at this and competitiveness, wide market strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So we also have a major role there. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. So also I wanted to ask you, going back to the theme of the conference, obviously AI is a foundational technology and it's dual use, let's say. It also has a security, let's say, defense dimension. We had David from NATO yesterday, and we know that it's one of the emerging and disruptive technologies that NATO has been identifying and working on. So what would you say is relevant in our discussion that also links to the security dimension?
Yeah, I was lucky to have like nearly an overlap between advising the Commission on AI and then entering as an advisor to the NATO EDT for the Secretary General. And actually, in that process, I met David, who was here yesterday, and the Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Joana. And they came out with the 6th principle for NATO on artificial intelligence. They have come out with their the latest cyber policy last week. So they are really picking up on this very, very fast. And I just participated 2 weeks ago in NATO's AI conference, where a new convention on use on AI for military use is being discussed between the allied nations. So I think we will see NATO taking a role. I know that we are seeing NATO taking a role much more towards private sector collaboration with EU, stepping into this space of collaborating with the EU and the private sector on both principle and policies and standards. We have internally also in Digital Europe just hired some excellent people in standardization and are really also stepping in to facilitate those common standards and these kind of works between the organizations. So, and I think we will see a new convention on use of AI for military use. I think it's already in the making, but we have already seen NATO also stepping into this. So definitely something where we also need to read it to what are the international rules on how we use AI.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia. The poll remains very, very divided about how we do this. I think it's a similar difference in terms of percentage points with the first question. So it doesn't look like overall the audience is too optimistic, but then again, maybe we're not quite sure because it's not too definitive, let's say. So maybe Dragos, can I ask you last? We got a question from the audience, and of course, when we talk about ChatGPT, talk about risks. I think this was we need to protect consumers. That's the idea. We need to create trust with consumers, and particularly, let's say, in the Libe committee in the parliament. That's obviously what you think about first. But the question from the audience is, shouldn't we be asking, as a first question, what bad might happen if we don't use this technology? And Judith also said, the biggest risk is that it will happen somewhere else. We can have all the protections in place here in Europe. We can insulate ourselves, protect all our consumers, but the technology will be developed somewhere else in the world, and that will be a risk anyway. So why are we doing this? What do you think?
Well, I fully agree that that risk is there, which is why I mentioned from the very start that balancing out between protecting and innovating, for me, is one of the most important exercises that we have to do with this regulation, because otherwise, again, we're seriously missing the target. So this continent has to be competitive. This continent has to encourage AI as the driving force for the digital economies of tomorrow. If we don't get that with everything we do, in the way we create the ecosystem for AI, because from my point of view, that is the reason why we still have that percentage of people who think it's easier to innovate elsewhere. It's not only because this is part of it, the fact that we are regulating maybe sometimes quicker than we should, but it's also because there are other elements missing in that ecosystem that makes companies to actually run quicker somewhere else than rather staying here in Europe. Even those that are developing their business here, they also choose to go elsewhere. And that, I think, has to do a lot with ecosystem, has to do a lot with jobs and availability of those engineers that are there to help grow businesses and so on and so forth, and finances, and there's a longer discussion. I don't want to go now into it. But again, for me, we are, as regulators, as legislators, we are acutely aware. I haven't felt, coming from any political groups during this discussion, I haven't felt, even the ones from the far left, that this awareness of this risk of losing sight of the need for competitiveness is not a key part of the conversation. So I think that's the good thing. And in terms of then why is it that we think it's important to regulate, I actually do think it is important to regulate. And I would say even for the businesses, and I haven't heard almost a single business, even on the US side, that does not say, listen, as far as AI is concerned, it is now the time to put rules in place. And okay, we will have maybe different normative environments here versus US. That also has to do with the culture and with the legal tradition in the two continents. But ultimately, and this I also link it to the discussion on standards, ultimately I'm convinced that we will be working with very similar, if not the same standards, very time soon. We are gearing up and we are also writing the rules in the AI Act to allow for that. to allow for quick alignments of standards and the way we produce those standards over here and on the US side. We are also working in writing the definitions in the text so that those definitions are, if possible, fully aligned with the definitions that are being developed on the US side, that are being developed on the OECD side. All this because we understand that converging with the other like-minded in the standards writing, in the definitions, is key to make sure that this regulation is not there to stifle whatever grows in Europe. And again, I feel that at least in the conversation we have in Parliament, but looking at the Council text, I don't think that we will be far apart when we will start the negotiations with the Council either, which actually gives me quite a strong reason to hope that when we start trialogues, we'll actually be able to progress fast and progress well in reaching out a good balanced text.
Very good. Thank you, Dragos. And thank you all. This is all we have time for. Thank you all for sharing your official and also personal thoughts. And personal thoughts are particularly appreciated. And good luck, especially to you and to Florian, let's say, as official Parliament and Council representatives here on the panel. And Mette, please, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks a lot.